Trader Joe's has believed in branded content for years, content marketing. You were into content marketing when it wasn't cool, with the Fearless Flyer for many years, the newspaper that shows up in people's mailboxes. And Joe was the first editor of that, right? Am I right? Why podcasting? Why is that the next chapter in content marketing for you?
I'll go first. So the Fearless Flyer is stories about products, right? And we say we are a store of stories. Advertising is a challenging realm for Trader Joe's because it's hard to tell a good story in 30 seconds. It's hard to tell a good story in a minute. So when we thought about telling stories, we thought about a podcast. People listen to podcasts to hear a story, to understand more about something they're interested in. More?
And I'd say that this is loud, as am I. We're accustomed to failure, and we're very comfortable with failing through things to find something that works. So you mentioned it was initially a 5-part thing, and it was, why not try a podcast? It was after a bunch of other stuff, and we didn't set out to have a podcast. We set out to solve a problem first, a problem that we thought that we had, that we wanted to correct, and so we just thought we'd try it. And we thought we'd try it with no expectation of anyone listening, which sounds foolish, but we wanted to bank it as information on the record from us in a way that we could control the story to send people toward, to point them toward if they had questions, because we don't talk a lot about ourselves normally, even though it's all we do.
It's all we do. But as a company, you know, we get accused of being secretive.
Right.
We're not secretive. We'd rather show you the work by offering you products on our shelves than talk about the work.
And looking at the photos that you found of us, I know why we're secretive. It's like, we got to work on that. Those were terrible.
Yeah, you should tell us when you're going to do that.
Yeah, I should have let you have approval on that, for sure. I think that's one reason that the podcast has done so well. It's such a phenomenal brand to begin with, and it's a great podcast, but you had that pent-up demand for information about Trader Joe's. You're not out there every day putting out press releases and things. In fact, I like to say that podcasts are the new press release, and I know Mary agrees with that, and you've used it very effectively in that sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's pass the mic to Chris. I want to find out how he got into that. You can hang on to one, Tara, that's fine. Pivot was the word in 2020, and yeah. you had quite the pivot, and I'm not talking about your golf swing, into podcasting. Tell us about that.
Of course. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a very big fan of your podcast, so passing mics feels very COVID safe as well. So,
I hope so.
So our podcast is really different, I think, from the others up here, which is ours is not a consumer-facing podcast. Ours is for a very specific niche audience, which is Emmy voters. And it was a real pivot. You know, National Geographic, everybody knows National Geographic, but it's been around for 133 years. But when it comes to the premium television streaming content business, the type of content we're making is relatively new for us. Award-winning, and that's a big part of our mission. And the best way we have found to immerse voters in our content is for them to touch and feel and experience it at gatherings, events, screenings, panels. So when COVID hit, that wasn't possible anymore. The year before, we had done what they call an Emmy FYC event, for your consideration event, at the Greek Theater for 5,000 people, where we had Morgan Freeman and Alex Honnold from Free Solo, and the voters got to interact with them, and it was a really successful event, and every show we featured there got at least one Emmy nomination. When COVID hit, you couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't have an event with 5,000 people, so we were trying to figure out, well, how can we showcase our content in a unique and different way to get out what it takes to make these programs to voters? And so our team came up with the idea of doing an FYC podcast. As far as I know, it was the first one. Now everyone seems to be doing them, but you know, my team had a great idea and we really carried through with it. So it is for a very niche targeted audience. There's 22,000 Emmy voters, and that's who the podcast is for.
And what are their names? Oh. It is a small audience, though. I mean, it's very, very targeted. And how did you let them know that you're doing a podcast, those Emmy voters?
Yeah, that's a great idea. In a number of ways, you know, the pieces of the campaigning that still existed were advertising and interviews and things with journalists. So
Number one.
Yeah.
Number one.
So we did a big mailer to all the journalists that cover the awards with the news about our podcast. Any paid advertising that we did for the Emmy campaign always had something in it about pushing people to the podcast. And all the talent, you know, we were very fortunate. All the talent we asked, from Ron Howard to Gordon Ramsay to Bear Grylls to Cynthia Erivo, who starred in our Genius Aretha series, all did the podcast. They were all thrilled to do it. And they all posted on social and helped push it out themselves as well. So, you know, it was a very targeted campaign, but we fairly successfully, I think, reached the audience it was intended for.
And it gave those people, as opposed to a consumer-facing venue, it gave them an opportunity to acknowledge people who had been important to them in the making of those shows.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was not a podcast trying to get people to watch these shows. It was a podcast to take people behind the scenes of what it took to make these shows. So Cynthia Erivo, how many hours did she spend in hair and makeup to turn into Aretha Franklin? What was that process like? What was it like singing all those songs live? You really got to go layers beneath of what it took for her to have that performance, which was nominated for an Emmy and a SAG Award and a Golden Globe Award and many others. We lost to Kate Winslet almost all of them, and they didn't have a podcast, which is annoying, but you know, I think that this sort of played a part in getting what it took for her to do this role, which when you watch on screen seems so seamless and that it was just natural, but it was a lot of work, and you really got to hear behind the scenes what it took for her to prepare for that role.
Things that people in the industry would be very interested in hearing. Chachi from Benstown McVeigh is in the house. There he is, co-producer of the podcast.
Fantastic partners. We obviously couldn't do it without them. I mean, we don't produce podcasts on my team, so we had a lot to learn, and it was a really, really great experience.
So I'm going to ask everybody this question, so get ready. The KPIs, the key performance indicators. No marketing discussion is complete without KPIs. What are yours?
KPIs, my favorite word. Look, our end result was, did we get a nomination for that show? That was really the end goal, and I would say about 85% of the content we featured over 2 seasons of the podcast got some type of Emmy nomination. So that was our end KPI, and we won a few too, which was nice.
Very nice. All right, Mary, I want to talk to you a little bit about lots of things. I wish we had time to talk at length with everybody here. But Mary, I want to put on the screen from your website, took a shot here. There you go. From your Godfrey Dadish site, as the editorial director for Godfrey Dadish, I'm guessing you had a lot to do with the writing of this. I love it. I'm not going to. Tom says audiobooks are big, but I won't turn this session into an audiobook by reading this to you. You can see it for yourself. You call this the new editorial. There's always been this wall, since the beginning of publishing, right? A wall between church and state, between content and editorial and the sales and advertising part. Is that wall coming down? That's what I feel like you're kind of saying.
I think the wall, not to evoke this image, but is being rebuilt rather than coming down, and is being reassessed. I have decades experience in journalism, came from a very traditional journalistic background, and started working with the team at Godfrey Dadish, which is staffed by a lot of former journalists and current journalists. I'm still a writer, I'm still an editor on a quarterly publication that you mentioned, thank you, Alta. But we all have in our backgrounds storytelling, whether that's storytelling through video or storytelling through podcasts or storytelling, which was for me more traditional print media. And what we've started to see was this interest in companies who want to tell their stories, but they don't want to tell stories necessarily about themselves. So they want to tell stories that are pertinent to their mission and that are pertinent to their audiences. And it's very different than what I was more accustomed to, which was called advertorial or sponsored content when I was working in more traditional printed form. And it's more about telling stories that will reach an audience that's very engaged, right? That's very targeted. In our case with the Microsoft work, business decision makers in particular who we're trying to reach, but also telling stories that might reach a broader audience than that. One of my best friends is a cancer researcher at USC. She listens to the podcast because she manages a lab, and she gets a lot of great information about how to manage during this particular time. So the birth of Work Lab, the podcast, came from a digital publication that we created for Microsoft called Work Lab that was to really dig into the future of work. They came to us and said, we have these extraordinary researchers and scientists on our staff, and we don't know how to tell their stories in a way that's engaging and reaches an audience because they have pertinent data that we think is really important for other people to be able to hear about, but how do we actually make that come to life? And they were so happy with the digital publication that we created a podcast for them. And with anything, with the Trader Joe's podcast, with the Nat Geo, with all the podcasts I listen to, what draws me into it as a storyteller is just the intimacy of the form. Like that I'm right in someone's, like literally in their ears, right? And I think that's one reason why, as we saw from the Edison research, that the advertising is so effective because there's just this warmth and intimacy to it, humor or pathos or whatever it is that you're talking about. That's just a connectivity that's really special and exciting. So the new editorial, to round back to that, for us is this idea that brands do have a responsibility to pick up some of the slack also that has been created by, to be honest, the Facebook, Google decimation of advertising as a base for print media. And companies need to help tell stories that need to be told, or else we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. Honestly, with just the reality of print and media just in general right now.
I would guess that you're not measuring your success by how many people write Mary in the upper right-hand corner to get 20% off their first order of Office 365 or something, but what are the KPIs then for this podcast?
Yeah, no, absolutely very similar to what Chris said. Like if we can reach business decision makers and help them, clients certainly, Microsoft is obviously a gigantic company that, probably most of us will have some kind of interaction with Microsoft in the next 24 hours here in this room. So if we can reach the business decision makers who need to know how to understand this unbelievably confusing time that we're living in right now and how to better manage their way through it, whatever the future of work looks like. And then certainly, if we can help them understand on occasion a little bit better, like how their products can help them to do that. But that's really not at all the intent of the podcast. And in fact, I spend a lot of time as a producer of the podcast editing out references that people make to the product, which is really a weird place to be in when you're working with a major corporation. But they actually don't want us to be pitching teams and pitching the product. They really want us to be talking about the bigger issues that we're all thinking about right now.
So, Matt and Tara, the KPI question. Your podcast comes out on occasional Mondays. On Tuesday, I'm guessing the CEO has you in and says, how many downloads? How many downloads? No? How do you measure success?
We don't really analyze according to data like the way most people do. We see the downloads, and Matt and I are really the only ones who pay any attention to how many downloads are happening.
It's a vanity project for us, Dave.
It really is.
Of course.
We get a lot of positive feedback. Crew members in our stores tell us they really like it. Customers tell us they really like it. We read the occasional review on the podcast apps, and sometimes they're really good for our egos, and sometimes not so much. But most of as long as we don't eat on mic, people seem to think we're okay. We just don't use any of those real analytical, data-driven tools. It's really about a feeling, and if people's feeling tends to be positive, then we're good with that.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, an old saw is that you get what you measure, and our podcast doesn't directly generate any business. Our business is in our stores. We sell groceries. So were we to measure things, it would be how sales are going, and there's this indirect connection there. So we're interested in that. We're interested in, again, I mentioned earlier about solving a problem. That problem was that we felt like in our reticent ways, in our not talking about anything, most people were getting our story wrong, and we were getting increasingly bothered by that. So we wanted a way to share some things that we thought were important, to get that info out there. And so then it started to resonate with journalists, with our own people, with our crew, with customers even. And so we were measuring, if you will, some of that feedback, and that's what's sort of driven it to where it is. But we don't have, we are the advertising, but we don't have other advertising. We're not looking for things to track clicks or likes necessarily. So it's an interesting thing. There's a real theme among the three entities here, though, that we're not necessarily looking for the end game, that the podcast is it. It's about other stuff.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's such an interesting point is, the event we did at the Greek Theater cost $1 million. So there were a lot of questions. What are you getting out of it? What are your KPIs? Relatively speaking, obviously, as everyone knows, podcasts aren't free. They take money, they take engineering, they take a lot of work. But relative to the cost I was spending on something else, it wasn't nearly that much. And nobody asked me any questions about it. They said, sounds great, you should go forward and do it. And that, I think, speaks to the power of podcasts, because relatively speaking, if you're doing a TV show, that's going to cost a lot more than it is to produce a podcast. So I think it's a safe medium for the people that we all report to allow us to experiment and have fun with and do interesting things, because relatively speaking to other activities that the company is investing in, it is not as high as those investments.
The expenditure in general, people in LA know this because you see it everywhere. The expenditure on for your consideration, advertising, marketing, events, so forth, it's enormous.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah. And it's in the contracts with the talent and the producers and everybody that you're going to spend a certain amount to try to get them an award as well. Tara and Matt, at Trader Joe's, I get the sense that that same attitude towards your marketing probably prevails in other things as well? Or are you measuring specific KPIs in your video, in your Fearless Flyer, the other things?
Not so much. Really, for us, it's branding, it's brand awareness, it's brand understanding. So we feel like, as Matt said, it's a way for us to tell our story in a way that we get to control the narrative so that it's not misunderstood. There was a lot of misunderstanding about Trader Joe's and how we operate and what we do. By putting these stories out there, whether it's in the podcast or whether it's in another format, we're building our brand, and that it's not so much about selling a particular product. It's really helping folks understand who we are as a brand, and for better or worse, people who listen to the podcast really have an understanding of the brand through us, and hope we're a little silly and sometimes very silly, but we're having a good time and we're enjoying all the pieces that go along with being a Trader Joe's crew member, and hopefully that comes through.
And I think
and we get to eat.
The point about efficiency or effectiveness or low-cost models is so important. Historically, back to Joe Colomb, the Joe in Trader Joe's, if you go to an idea of the Dymaxion from Buckminster Fuller, the most output for the least input, that's always been important for us. Consumer packaged goods companies might spend 12% or more of revenue on advertising or things like this. Trader Joe's historically, it's like ours isn't even a rounding error. Like, we have nothing to work with by design. That's important. And so this format, it turns out, is really effective because it's mostly just tying up our time. And although we have other jobs, I think the company looked at it as like we don't have to pay them anything else to do this.
Yeah, because...
Well, a full-page ad in the New York Times of advertising can cost $125,000. You see it that day and it goes in the recycle bin. I'm imagining you can produce many episodes for that same amount of money that live forever on all of the podcasting listening. So it is actually such an ingenious and effective tool. And I imagine when you get one tweet that says, "Oh my God, I love the Trader Joe's podcast this week," that is your measure of success. Whereas like when Ron Howard says, "Wow, I really appreciated being able to tell the story about why this film was important to me in this safe environment," like that is a measure of success.
Yeah, and honestly, a really fun thing that I notice happening is social media, for all of its pitfalls, other listeners promote the content more in a way that we never could. So you connect with people on a personal level, and they promote you to other people. And it's just a constant flow of that promotion by others of your own content.
You two are quoted so often in not just trade press, but everywhere, because the podcast has become the press release from Trader Joe's. Today Show, Eater, Eat This, Not That, all of those. And
All the greats, yeah.
yes, yeah.
My mother loves when we get quoted in Real Simple. So just,
Real simple. Mom's watching that one.
Yep.
And so this is prop number 2 or 3. The Springle Jangle from Trader Joe's, Chris. You mentioned on the most recent episode of the podcast that the walls in Claude Monet's house in France are yellow, but not this yellow, not quite this yellow. Where do you come up with this stuff? Do you prep for that?
Well, it's true. It's true, though. I mean, the walls in Monet's house are a color very similar to that.
Does that make it expensible to go to France? Is that...
That's a good idea. No, it's just, it's something that, I mean, it's, I just can't shut up about stuff, so I just kind of go, and it's this condition. But it's something that hopefully, and it made the cut. And in the spirit of candor, Dave, we work with your team to make our podcast. So sounds that brand actually helps us sound good. Just to be clear. So, keeping that kind of stuff in there does allow for some degree of armchair travel that lets people sort of in on something that the world is cool and the world should be experienced. And if it starts with tasting something you've never tasted from a place you've never been, that's great.
Story.
And that's what we'd like to have happen. And it's just goofy that, I happen to have been there and thought about that because at home we talked about painting one part of the house that color, which engendered a bunch of other stuff. But, yeah, that's real.
I have to tell you that I every time I go to Google to look for your podcast, Google tells me that I might be asking the question, apparently it's common, who are the hosts of the Trader Joe's podcast? Tell us about those people. Did you expect to be celebrities? I know that's probably not why you went to work for a grocery store.
Probably not. I'm not sure celebrity is the right word, but it's fun.
Yeah. Chris, Jeff Goldblum, I've got the list. Ron Howard, it's a partial list. Brian Grazer, Cynthia Erivo, you mentioned a lot of these folks. That is a lineup that could draw a mass audience. Have you thought about going into another realm and doing some podcasts for the general public?
The honest answer is no, not for what I do. National Geographic has a very successful podcast called Overheard that is produced out of the editorial team. I'm not the editorial team, so I strategically, in order to be able to have the freedom to do this podcast in the way we wanted, did not want anyone to think that we were trying to compete with the Overheard podcast, which is the very successful, very big consumer-facing National Geographic podcast. So no, I think ours is for the niche audience that we created it for, and that's who we will market it to and really focus on. I can understand, everyone wants to hear from celebrities, and I know people have found it and listened to it and enjoy it, and that's great, but that's not going to ever be the focus of what my team does or our area of responsibility.
Mary, working in this content marketing space so much, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So much of what Tom showed us would lend you to believe that things are moving more and more in the content marketing direction. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine so. I think this is partly answer to that because I want to just build on something that Tara was saying about the reach question and a little bit more about the KPIs because it's relevant to the content marketing question, is that when you're thinking about how to measure success with this, with podcasts or whatever, and it's always dangerous to get into the game of predictions, right? But I do see, just as a veteran of media, that this is all headed in one direction, and it's smaller, more engaged audiences, right? Like, and the phrase boutique is used a lot, right? I hear that a lot, but the importance of really building a community around your brand, your media company, your nonprofit, whatever that is, and not measuring things in masses who are spread really thin, but in a smaller group that is really eager to be engaged, to invest in your brand. And I use that word investment not just in a financial sense, but in an emotional sense, and an intellectual sense, and to come back. So when you do at events, they want to engage more deeply with you, and there is a financial, possible like benefit to all of this, right? Of like really being able to have subscribers who really are invested in what you're doing, rather than just touching upon a lot. And I think the more that we see, and brands are going to be really smart to think that way of like, how do I build maybe not this gigantic audience, but this audience that's really going to invest in what we do.
Well, this has been a great discussion. We are rolling past our end time here. I want to thank you all for being here. Tara Miller, Matt Sloan, Mary Melton, Chris Albert, and let the record show that no publicity clause 14C was not violated by me in the Trader Joe's contract. But thank you for that acknowledgement. And thank all of you for coming too. Brian, thank you for emceeing. Steve, thanks for getting up there. Tom, the data is always fantastic. Did I leave anybody out? Question? Yeah, you got time for Q&A? Okay. Go ahead. Let's do it. Yes. Stephanie? No.
The diamond. There is a whole underground Trader Joe's wine group that I have now joined, and I want to thank you for that. I'm a hero to my family. As soon as the podcast comes out, I listen to it, I hear what is coming in, and I send it out to everyone that I know, and they need to go shop for whatever's in season. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I so enjoy listening to it. I love the community that you build with it and make it very neighborhoody, and so yeah, wasn't really a question, but thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you. So there's the KPI, Dave. Jeez, crying out loud. So that's what it's about. And I mean, we have the easiest gig ever, because there are lots of people who work really hard in every store, hopefully in your store, to make that happen every day. And the people who figure out how to make products and make those products go from an idea to a real package of stuff that might match Monet's walls or not. But there are lots of people who are really smart and really capable doing lots of great stuff. So it's easy for us. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't need to add anything.
But to what Mary said, I mean, that's the exact example of community right there.
We planted her. Just kidding.
That's what happens in our stores, though, right? So what we're doing is hopefully a reflection and a reinforcement of what goes on inside the four walls of the store every single day.